morning. You were starting tonight in Luke chapter 20, verse 45, and we're probably going to obviously go on into chapter 21. We're getting down to in the next chapter or so, in chapter 22 especially, we're going to see where everything starts to happen with regards to Jesus' crucifixion. We studied last week about how he got in controversy with the Sadducees, the Pharisees. There were others that created it. We remember the context is also found in Matthew chapter 23. And it seems like he would answer one question right after another. He also knew that his time on this life or in this life was going to be very, very short. So as we come to the end of the passage in Luke chapter 20, we find in verse 45 through verse 47 that he said this in hearing of all the people, but he said it specifically to the disciples. He says, beware of the scribes who go around in long robes, love greetings in the marketplace, the best seats in the synagogues, the best places at feast, who devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. These will receive the greater condemnation. So in these three verses, really what it boils down to, and he's saying it in such a way to where everybody could hear it, he then in essence condemns the scribes for everything that they're doing. Now, if you're reading in Matthew's account, most of Matthew 23 is nothing but woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Matthew goes into a lot more detail of Jesus' specific condemnation of the things that they were doing, and Matthew gets more of the details of why their condemnation is such. Luke does not mention that. Again, I think part of the reason is because Luke does it in three verses, whereas you've got most of Matthew 23. Matthew is mainly writing to the Jews. He's writing to people who knew the scribes. He's writing to people who knew the Pharisees. He's writing to them, and they would probably know everything that Jesus was saying was absolutely true. Luke is mainly writing to the Gentiles. They probably did not have a clue who the scribes and the Pharisees were in that culture in the area around Jerusalem. Because again, if he was writing mainly for the Gentiles, they would not have known that. And that, I believe, is the reason why he sums up everything in those three verses. But notice, at the same time, he makes clear about how he feels about it. Number one, the scribes desire to go about in long robes. So they're dressing in long robes. Their attire is such that everybody knows that they're scribes, and everybody, especially the Jews, would give them a great deal more respect because of that reason. They love greetings in the marketplaces. So they go around in long robes. They're going around in the marketplaces. Everybody's, saying, hello, Rabbi, hello, sir, and giving them the respect that they thought that they needed. They would always receive the best seats in the synagogue. If you were in Jewish lands and you went into a synagogue, it might be something like, and I stress the word might be something like our churches, in that in front of everybody, you would have the head of the synagogue. So each one of the scribes might be one of the heads of one of the synagogues around there in that respect. You would also have the elders of the synagogue, and they would always, it seems like from everything I've read, they would all be sitting around in the front. Then, through the course of a Sabbath day synagogue service, they would read from the Torah. They would listen to the scribes' interpretation of certain things. They would obviously, at the same time, emphasize what the responsibilities of the Jews were. The Jews had to make sure that the synagogues were taken care of, so that they continued the education of the Jewish young men as they're growing up in the Jewish religion. So these are men that are going to be highly respected. They would have the best seats in the synagogues. They would enjoy the best places at the feasts. In other words, when it came time to eat, they would They would be in the positions of honor. They would be the first served, as it was, because they were very important people to the Jews. Luke, as I said, just kind of goes through it very quickly. Jesus says, beware of them. What does that mean to beware of something? Watch out. Watch out. And the warning that Jesus gives us is a warning, whenever he's talking to the Jews about the scribes and so forth, is a warning that still is applicable to us today. Now, we don't have scribes. We don't have elders sitting in the front of the auditorium as it was, and everybody's looking up to them. You know, we listen to preachers, yes, but the thing that we've got to think about in this respect is that these men were doing this a lot of times just for their honor. They also enriched their pockets from the people in the synagogue more often than not. And so the Jews may have felt very antagonistic toward them, but they weren't going to say anything to these people because they could have had them kicked out of the synagogue. They could have had them withdrawn fellowship from the synagogue. And for the Jews, the synagogue was the most important part of being a Jew. So there's a lot going on here. And he's just telling them, he says, you watch out for these people. Realize what they're doing. Notice what they do. They're doing everything because they want the praise of men. They desire to go in long robes, greetings in the marketplaces, best place, in the synagogues and at the feasts. But what else were they doing? Well, the Bible says that they were devouring widows' houses. Here's what happens whenever you have people that are lusting for power. They become prideful. And again, whenever they are proud, they think everybody owes them something, some way, somehow or another. We think a lot about the idea of, do politicians serve us or do we serve them? And again, I'm not trying to get into that discussion, but you get the idea of what I'm trying to say. The same thing was going on with the scribes there at that particular time, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, those who sat in authority over the synagogues and especially at the temple. You had pride and power. So they would go through all of this. They devoured these widows. And the way they would do this, there's a lot of times, even the Talmud, this was a Jewish commentary on the Old Testament, they would talk about the plundering of widows. The Pharisees and the scribes claimed an exact knowledge of the law, perfect obedience of it. Of course, they weren't trying to do it themselves. They were very, they would cheat you at a heartbeat. That's just the way they were. So what would happen is they pretended to stand for justice for the poor, for perfect obedience to the law. They were putting on an act of show, as it was, of showing friendship for the distressed. They were willing to help those who were in financial straits, and more often than not, this would be widow women. And so what they would do is they would go over there and say, you know what, you know, you've lost your husband, you've got a family to take care of, you or not. You've also got a household to take care of. Tell you what, we're going to take this responsibility off of you. And if you will, you know, in essence, give us the opportunity to help you out by managing your property, let us be the guardians, let us pay your bills, let us do these things. We could be the executors of whatever you've got to deal with. We're there to help you. And what often happened, these Jews took advantage of those widows. In fact, one of the Maccabean rulers, this was during the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, warned that his wife on his deathbed, he said, do not trust anything the Pharisees say to you. Don't trust them. So it's interesting that this is what they're trying to do. And Jesus tells it like it is here. He says they're making long prayers. They're going to receive the greater condemnation. As I said, if you go more in detail about this, you can see this in Matthew chapter 23, where Jesus condemns them in very forceful language over and over and over again. These are also, and I want you to think about this for just a moment, these are also the last words that Jesus is really going to say concerning the Pharisees and so forth until the trial. He's not going to talk to the Pharisees or the Sadducees or any of these other people again until he is actually facing them in at night in the court of Annas and Caiaphas. So it just kind of gives you those ideas of what's going on here. Publicly, he's not going to be, until the events of the cross, he's not going to be attacked again. They've realized they can't cause him to make a slip in the tongue and cause the Jews to give up following him. So now they are planning for the whole thing about him being crucified. So this is where they're going to go. But that doesn't mean that Jesus, even though they're backing off, Jesus knows exactly what they're planning to do. But Jesus uses this opportunity to spend time talking about what's about to happen in Jerusalem. Now, again, if you're reading Matthew's account, this account gets into a lot more detail than Luke's account does. Beginning in Matthew 23, you find the condemnation of the scribes and the Pharisees. Matthew 24 starts to talk about the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and segues, as it was, into Matthew 25 to talk about the judgment of the world. Now, it's important to get in our minds that difference. Matthew 24 is talking about something that they would see in their lifetime. And I just want to encourage you, if you've got your Bibles for just a moment, just to kind of get an idea of what's going on here. He begins to talk about the signs at the end of the time. Matthew 24, verse 3. Tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? When we look at this from Matthew's account, you've got to remember, again, Matthew is mainly writing to the Jews. So as far as they were concerned, when Jesus came again, that would be the end of the world as they knew it. When Messiah came, that would be the end of the world as they knew it. And they would think, of course, that Messiah was going to set up a whole earthly kingdom here on this earth, and that he would defeat the Romans or whoever got in their way from that point forward, and he would set up a new kingdom. Now, there are many religious groups today, many that claim to be Christian, that uses the passage of Matthew 24 and 25 to say, yes, Jesus is coming again and going to set up an earthly reign over all the world in the city of Jerusalem. And they go to Matthew 24 and 25 to bring that ideal out. And so it's important for us to realize that he's saying here, specifically to the disciples in Matthew 24, he says, take heed that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, saying, I'm the Christ, will deceive many. You'll hear wars and rumors of war. See that you're not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there'll be famines, pestilences, earthquakes. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Now, if you're just reading this passage without looking at the whole context, you might begin to believe that what Jesus is saying here could be talking about the end of the world as we know it. And that's the way a lot of people do read this passage. The ideal of nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom, wars, famines, pestilences. Notice he says in verse 9 of chapter Matthew 24, they shall deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. You shall be hated by all nations for my name's sake. They will be offended, will betray one another, hate one another, false prophets, lawlessness. He says, the gospel of this kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations. And then he says, verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, notice there's that idea of Judea. So it's not the end of the world, but it's something that's going to take place in Judea. Notice he said, if you're in the housetop, don't go down. If you're in the field, don't go back to get your clothes. Woe to those who are pregnant, nursing, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. There'll be a great tribulation, since it has not been since the beginning of the world, nor shall be. The days shall be shortened. And he goes on and he says, okay, you read on through the rest of this, and then you get to chapter 24, 29. The tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened. All through the Old Testament, the phrase or the idea of the sun being darkened suggests the destruction of a kingdom. The sun obviously would be the king. The stars would represent the princes and so forth. And he said, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the heaven. All the tribes of the earth shall mourn. They shall see the Son of Man coming in the cloud of his glories. He will send his angels. But notice what he goes on and says. He says this. He says, when you see all these things, he's talking to the people of that day. When you see all these things, he said, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Everything Jesus has talked about from Matthew 23 and 24, verse 34, is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, not the end of time. In verse 36, he shifts. He says, but of that day and hour, no man knows, not even the angels in heaven. Two women will be grinding at the mill, two men will be in the field. But he said, there's not going to be any signs of when the Son of Man is going to come back at the second coming. He gave them a bunch of signs for the destruction of Jerusalem. And then he switches over to when it's going to be like when he comes again. And he says, in essence, everybody's going to continue to do the things that they were doing all along. We then read in Matthew 25, the parable of the 5 wise and the 5 foolish virgins that were going to attend a marriage feast. And the emphasis of that parable is the idea, always be prepared, because you don't know when the Son of Man is coming. But he had said earlier in Matthew 24, he says, you can know when you see all these things taking place. He says, then you can know that I'm coming to judge Jerusalem. And I think those things help us to understand a little bit more about, as you read all of Matthew 24 and then you come back to Luke, remember that Luke is not writing to a mainly Jewish audience. He's writing to the Gentiles. So what does he begin to talk about? Wars, commotions, nations rising against nations, great earthquakes. He says, and he goes on and he says, verse 20 of chapter 21, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. Okay. So after he emphasizes this up to verse 24, he's still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. But then in 25, chapter 21, verse 25, he talks about the coming of the Son of Man. It's the same idea that what we read in 24 and 25, chapter 24 and 25 of Matthew just goes into a lot more detail than what we have here in Luke chapter 21. So I wanted to kind of give you that broad outline. Any questions or comments about this? Thoughts, ideas?
Hey, Tommy, I've got a question.
Okay.
It could be a comment, but going back to chapter 20 and verse 45.
Okay.
Is he saying that, so even though he's talking to the disciples, it says while all the people were listening, is he intentionally speaking loud enough for everybody to hear?
I think so.
He's addressing it. Okay.
Absolutely. And again, because he's a preacher and because of this way he is going to be speaking, he didn't have obviously a PA system like we have nowadays. So he obviously has to do it loud enough to where everybody hears it. So where they also, not only just his disciples, but everybody would understand the threat as it was of the scribes and so forth of what they're doing. So
what he had to say wasn't just for the disciples, it was for everybody around.
It was for everybody around. And no doubt, as the events continue to play out, a lot of them are going to be thinking more and more and more about what Jesus is saying, especially after Jesus' resurrection and he shows himself alive to everybody. yes, we need to follow him, not these scribes and Pharisees and everybody else.
Mhm.
You make a very
And
great observation there. Thank you.
then in verse 47, he ends with, these will receive greater condemnation.
Mhm.
Is this just how Luke expresses himself in the writing, or are there degrees of condemnation?
I believe there's degrees of condemnation. There are other passages in Matthew, obviously to the Jews. Here in this particular place, he's speaking mainly to Gentiles. I believe that there will be greater condemnation depending upon the sin. Okay, and in that respect, and a lot of it also, I believe, is really dependent upon what we know. If we know to do good and do it not, to him it is
Mhm.
sin. We remember and think about those passages. If we don't live up to what we're saying that we are, then I believe, yes, we will know, because we know more and we know better of how we ought to be living. I believe that God's judgment will be 100% just all the way through. And as I mentioned even Sunday, the idea that God knows our very thoughts, the thoughts that motivate our actions. So yes, his judgment will be perfect in the fact that he will not only know what we've done, but he will also know why we did it. And that's why, no judge on this earth today could ever judge anybody, because they can't read people's minds. They don't know what they were thinking at that moment in time. It would probably make it easier for a lot of judgment today if they really knew what was on everybody's mind when they're doing whatever it is that they're doing. But on the day of judgment, that will be the case. So yes, I do believe that there will be different, and again, we get into this discussion, different levels of punishment. What's that going to look like? I don't know. I don't know how that's really going to be working out. But I think about it even in we don't even have to think beyond our own families in that respect. If our children do something that is worse than another thing that they do, maybe they as we would call it, told a white lie or something like that, and we think, well, that's not a big deal. That's they were trying to get out of trouble, whatever. Of course, it is in God's sight. Don't get me wrong. But if they go and get a gun and rob somebody, that's a whole nother issue, is it not? So, and we even, in a sense, even in our justice system today, we try to, and it's a very infallible system, but we try to make the punishment to fit the crime.
Mhm.
So in like manner, if a Christian was in the church and has been in the church and heard gospel preaching and knows exactly what they ought to be doing and so forth, and they're going to be held in they're going to be held in account, as opposed to somebody who's never picked up a Bible and read it. Now, will that person who has never picked up a Bible and read it, will they be punished? Yeah, but to what extent? How? Again, I believe there is going to be a greater condemnation, but how that's going to work out, I can't tell you. So does that raise more questions?
No, that's good. Thank you. But
Okay, thank you.
yeah,
Thank
any
you.
condemnation is not good.
And that's right. That's
Thank
the
you.
thing. I don't want to be that part. I don't want to get on that part of it. I want to make sure I'm on the other part of it, receiving the victory in Jesus, as we call it. So that's where I want to be. That's what I want to be. And I thank God for what Jesus did for me. That's it. All right. Now I've kind of covered a lot of material here, but let's get back to chapter 21, verse 1. He's now sitting in the temple. He has done, as it was, he hasn't done all of his preaching, but he's had the last words that he's going to have with the scribes and Pharisees, like I said, until the time that he's going to be put to death on the cross, the trial and everything. So now you have the situation where he's sitting there watching. Now, as I've mentioned before, the temple was broken down into a lot of different areas. You had the temple itself, where the priest and only the priest could be. You would have the temple or the court of the men. The men would be allowed to go closer to the actual temple. Then you would have the court of the women, and then you would have the court of the Gentiles. All around the temple, you would read signs, and you can look this up on the internet and see it for yourself to see exactly what I'm talking about. But there would be signs and intervals around the court of the Gentiles that if a Gentile goes past this point, he would be killed. All right. So that's how serious they were about it. The women could go, the Jews could go into that area to where they're offering the sacrifices or buying the sacrifices. Then you would have the court of the women. Women were not supposed to go any closer to it than that. And then you'd have the actual priests and what the court of the men, and then the priest actually serving in the temple itself. So it was right here in the court of Israel, in the court of the women, and right around this same area was also in all probability, it was the court of the treasury, the place of the treasury. They needed money to keep on doing what needed to be done. So it was probably here that, especially around the court of the Gentiles, the court of the women, where they would be buying animals to offer as sacrifices. They would be paying out money for other issues as well. In the women's court, there were 13 bronze trumpet-shaped boxes. And by a trumpet, just think about the bell of a trumpet. All right. Maybe the way I look at it sometimes, most of us have probably been to the mall at one time or another, and you could put a little coin in this one thing and it goes around in a big old circle and goes all the way down to the bottom. Right. That's what the trumpet would look like. So as these were made of bronze. There were 13 of them all the way around. And again, they were narrow at the mouth, wide at the bottom. And every one of the trumpets had different, as you came in there to worship, you would give money for specific things in different trumpets, in different boxes, you might call it that way. So you would have to pay a half shekel temple tax for the current year and the year immediately past. You would have to pay for the sin offering. And this would be specifically maybe for the women, for the purpose of purchase of turtle doves, for their sin offering. You would have offerings of purchase of wood for the temple. You would have to have the wood for the temple for the sacrifices. You would have the purchase of incense, the purchase of golden vessels. If you had money you set aside for sin offering, if you had money left over after that, you would, offering the birds, the trespass offerings, the offering of the Nazarite when he was cleansed, the cleansed leper, the voluntary offerings. All of these chests were open and accessible in the women's court. And Jesus goes out and he sits down and he starts watching everybody as they give. I've often thought about the idea that, as Jesus is sitting there, and many of them maybe knew who Jesus was. And I wonder what they were thinking as they were seeing Jesus and their offerings at that moment in time. I wonder if all of us sat down for a few moments to make some application to us, if we thought to ourselves that Jesus is sitting right beside us as we partake of the Lord's Supper, as we sing, as we pray, as we listen to the sermon, as we do all of this, would it affect the way we do worship? Would we put more into it? That's kind of, I think, what Jesus was doing here. What are you doing here? He's just watching them. And so you think about all the different people he's seeing. He's probably seen some of the scribes and Pharisees that he may have locked horns with. He probably is seeing these widow women who were being taken advantage of. He probably were seeing the poor. And obviously he does in this particular context, this widow's mites, we talk about it in verse 20, chapter 21. He's seeing that too. And he's making judgment calls on their lives and what they're doing and what they're giving. You see, unlike anybody else, he knew the person. He knew what the problems were in their lives. He knew everything about them. And so he saw the rich put in the money. And a lot of times, like in the malls, as we used to do, put in those coins and watch them go around in a circle. No doubt these rich people would pour in a big bunch of money. And so everybody's around like, wow, there's a lot of money. Go to a, I've seen this, I've read about this before, where an Indian comes into a big city like New York. And whenever the Indian is there, he talks to the friend that has him there and he says, I hear a frog. And the guy says, he starts looking around. He said, I don't see no frog anywhere. The Indian walked over and picked it up out of one of the areas where there was a tree. He said, there's a frog. And he said, why couldn't I hear that? Why couldn't I hear that? And so he says, watch this. The Indian dropped the coin and everybody stopped. They're all looking because, there's the coin. Was that what was happening whenever these rich people were giving their money, making their show? Was it all about show? Was it all about everybody impressed with them and their money? You see, there's a challenge there. Now, at the same time, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury, but he also saw a certain poor widow putting in 2 mites. Now, I mentioned earlier that Jesus knows the hearts of everybody, and he did. But notice he says, this poor woman has put in more than all of them. For all these out of their abundance have put in offerings for God, but she out of her poverty put in all the livelihood she had. We talk a lot about sacrifice and what sacrifice boils down to. And sometimes maybe our sacrifice as we worship God might be sitting in a building that's a little bit cold or a little bit hot. We're still very comfortable seated on padded pews. We sing. We have the aid of microphones and so forth where everybody can hear what's being said. Just picture all this and Jesus, out of all the people putting in their gifts, he commends this poor widow than anything else. And think about this. The 2 mites, they were also called lepta. So we get down into this. This was probably the smallest possible coin that you could ever possibly imagine at that time. And again, the size of it. So you're talking about these 2 mites might be worth, according to one commentator that was writing back in 1973. Okay, so try to keep that in mind. This commentator suggested that her gift might have been worth 60 cents. 60 cents. But that's all she had. And so it shows her heart, and it shows that Jesus knew, just like he knows our hearts, as we give, as we sing, as we pray, as we are partaking of the Lord's Supper, as we are interacting with one another. He knows our hearts. He knows whether we're doing it with all of our hearts, with all of our soul, mind, strength. He knows if we are putting on airs from time to time. And as I look at this passage, and as I think about it in my own life, I appreciate the fact that Luke, Matthew, and others bring out these ideas that when it comes to our worship, I think on any given Sunday morning, we could be distracted by so many different things. The preacher may stutter when he says something. A baby may cry. Oh, I'd love to hear more babies. Amen. Somebody's cell phone has to go off. So many distractions. Is God truly pleased with our worship? Notice this poor widow has put in more than all of them. Well, it wasn't much, Lord, maybe 60 cents. That's not much. As far as he was concerned, this woman put in more than all the rich put in combined. Why? Because this was all she had. That's what he says. She put in all the livelihood that she had. A poor widow giving everything she had. It shows her trust in God. It shows that no matter what, she gave everything to God, knowing that God was going to take care of her and had been taking care of her all along. Look at her faith. And you see, Jesus saw this, and I have no doubt again in my mind that she was going to be taken very good care of because of this. And that's the point that Jesus is trying to make. Again, she gave more than all of them. She is in the midst of poverty herself. She has given everything. Go through scriptures. Go through scriptures. See how many times it's the widows who are giving more, seems like, than anybody else. Why? Their trust in God. Their trust knowing that God's going to take care of them, even though it might be everything they've got. And there's the lesson for all of us. So as we think about this, we have to realize that Jesus, in these words, condemned the rich, but also commended the widow. Now, I want to remind you of the fact that he did say, this widow has put in more than they all, for they out of their abundance. Now, Jesus also was able to make those kind of statements because he knew the hearts, he knew what's going on behind the scenes. He knows our hearts. And I challenge all of us to think about every Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, all of these things, that we really make sure that our hearts are where they need to be. Because true or false, we could give, our hearts are going to make the difference. Now, I appreciate the question somebody has asked. Somebody just asked, does this mean that we should give everything we have today? In one sense, yeah. And I know this may shock everybody, but yeah, Jesus, he's not expecting us to sell our homes and everything like that. But think about the first century Christians. They gave up home. They gave up properties. They gave up everything just to be a Christian. And the challenge is for each and every one of us, how much should we give? And that brings us up to another big discussion. Many times in the Lord's church, whenever we would preach about giving, we would always emphasize, and I know I've heard preachers say this, and I probably have too. Under the Old Testament law, they gave at least 10% of what they had. So we are living under a better covenant, so we ought to be giving more. I've heard that said. And again, I think sometimes maybe we said that. Some person has actually said that what they give in the Old Testament was 10%. It was the tithe, as it was. But a lot of times the tithe, the money, didn't include the sacrifice of animals and everything else. And some people have even gone so far as to say that the Jews under the Old Testament gave up to anywhere from 25 to 30% of what they had. When you think about the cost of the animals, when you think about the money they had to give for the temple upkeep, whatever they had to give, all of these other things, we get somewhat antsy when we start talking about how much we give to the church. At the same time, we don't, as elders, preachers, we don't go around, though some churches do this, we don't go around and send you a tax bill, okay? And emphasize the idea that this is how much you're going to have to pay the church this year, right? One person pointed out this point, if someone had a need, that need was taken care of by the church. That's true. And again, here's something that I think a lot about. And I've been accused, brethren, of being an anti-building preacher. That we spend too much on buildings, and that you're against buildings, so therefore you're a anti-preacher or anti-building preacher. Maybe I am. Okay. I think about the amount of money we spend on buildings. As an elder, I've really thought a lot about it whenever we have to make decisions about getting things done at the building. I never will forget whenever we finally got the numbers in on the building at South Cobb. And I was sitting in there with Randy, Allen, and Johnny, and Henry. And I was sitting in there in that respect. And whenever they gave us the estimate of how much the building was going to cost to build, I was like, I can't believe this. It cost at that time, that building plus the property was right around $1 million. $1 million. And ever since, we've had to keep it up one way, somehow or another. Repainting, all this other stuff, all that stuff costs money. And I'm oft made to wonder if God's going to hold us accountable for how much we've spent on a building that he's going to burn up one of these days. My opinions, I'm not condemning that, but again, I've been called an anti-building preacher. Whenever they met in the first century, where would they meet? In people's homes. We know that Philemon had a house church. Obviously, Philemon was a part or had a part of the church in Colossae. So it may very well be that they didn't build, and obviously they didn't build huge buildings like we have today. They took the money that they had from Acts chapter 6 and other passages. They took care of the widows, 1 Timothy chapter 5. But I think that was also part of what was commanded even in the Old Testament. And that's kind of what was the system, was the system under the Old Testament law that come on into the New Testament law. So as I'm talking about all of this, I'm not condemning the use of buildings. We've got to have a place to worship. Okay. Don't write me up in any brotherhood papers and talk about how weird Tommy is. Y'all know it. Y'all still love me anyway, and I appreciate that. Okay. But do we spend too much on the buildings? I mean, whenever we're having to do this, that, and the other, I think we do spend it way too much on that and not taking care of what we need to take care of. We're not taking care of brethren that need help. I would much rather take possibly the money and help a brother that was having financial trouble because he lost a job to help pay for a house or pay for a house payment for a little while or something. And so you see what I'm trying to say there. It's just I've shared with you my opinion, and my opinion means exactly that. And whenever you commiserate and think about what we've talked about tonight, please don't think I'm a weirdo, but it is something that I think the church itself will be having to give answer for on the day of judgment. The Lord will say, I gave you all these things. What did you do with them? Well, Lord, we built $1 million building. You talking about that building I just burned up down there? How's that going to look? What's that going to look like? I know you may again. I think we do sometimes spend too much on frivolous things. I think that a lot of times we have tried to do things and help others with that. And we've tried to bless others by doing that. But again, is it still enough? Think about the people in the community that we're around. We have the obligation. Galatians 6 says we're supposed to especially take care of those who are of the household of faith. Absolutely. We're not supposed to be trying to help somebody that's just wanting a free handout and is not willing to work. At the same time, judgment has to be made. And sometimes, again, we spend more on upkeep than we do in trying to help people. So that's my opinion. All right. And I don't, that's probably all I need to say about that. Give me your ideas. Give me your thoughts, folks. Everybody at once, okay? Okay. All right. It's something to think about, right? It is something to think about. All right, let's go back to what was going. He was blessing this lady because she had put in all that she had. All righty. Now we get to verse 5, and I'm going to take about the next 5 minutes, and then we'll quit. Some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations. Think about the idea of what we just talked about. This temple at that time had been adorned with stones. Back in the Old Testament, the temple had been destroyed on at least 2 occasions. Babylon totally destroyed it. They had to rebuild it. We remember during the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, they had rebuilt the temple or started rebuilding the temple. And so as we're looking at that, by the time Jesus comes on the scene, Herod the Great had given bunches of money to have this temple that Jesus was sitting in at this time rebuilt. It took about 40 years for that temple to be rebuilt to where it was at this moment in time. And part of the reason was because the Jews were afraid that Herod was going to try to destroy the temple. So everything that had to be done had to go through the Jews, and Herod had to just make sure that he was doing it exactly the way they wanted it done. And literally, it was just a very short period of time before they finally finished that temple that Rome was going to come and destroy it all over again in AD 70. I'm telling you the story to suggest the idea that that temple was destroyed, had been destroyed. And as we're looking at all of that, we have to consider the idea. Jesus is saying, he said, you see these things which you see, the days will come in which not one stone will be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. Jesus, in this passage, predicted the destruction of the temple. And that's where, as I said, if you're reading Matthew's account, Matthew 24, 1 through 35, that's what he's talking about and what that's going to look like. So then they ask him, saying, Teacher, when will these things be? What will be the sign when these things are about to take place? If this place is going to be destroyed again, then it would be good to know if there's any signs so that we can be prepared to get out of town again. Now, think about the idea. The Jews had 2 or 3 temples destroyed already. So now, once again, same song, second verse. Why? Because of their sins, because they weren't obeying the Lord. This was the last chance they had to be obedient to Christ as Messiah. Many of them rejected him. Many of them received him. And so he says, listen, do not be deceived. Many will come in my name saying, I am he, and saying the time is drawn near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and commotions, do not be terrified. These things must come to pass first, but the end will not come immediately. Jesus is giving them things to look for. Now think about going back and literally read Jeremiah and some of those other books where, again, the Babylonians come and take Jerusalem and in 3 separate waves. And there was plenty of time for the Jews to repent, plenty of time for them to get their act together, but they didn't do it. Here again, he's emphasizing this whole idea. The time is drawn near. He said, you're going to hear about all of this. In 64 AD, the Jews revolted against Roman rule. They had been looking for Messiah all this time. They thought all along that Jesus was Messiah until he died on the cross. He didn't fulfill their expectations. So they started their own. And before it's over with, this war that lasted from 64 to 60 or to 70 AD was a long, protracted war with Roman armies now coming in and attacking Jerusalem as the seat of all of this. He says these things must come to pass, but the end will not come immediately. You're going to have opportunities, Jesus is saying, to get out. You're going to have opportunities to get away. He then says, nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, great earthquakes in various places, famines, pestilences, fearful signs, great signs from heaven. And again, if we take this all out of its context, then we could pretty well make these words fit most of history. Am I correct? And the thing is he's trying to emphasize this. You have times of peace, times of prosperity, but then he says what? He says, there'll be fearful signs, great signs from heaven. But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and into prisons. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. Think about the Apostle Paul being taken to Rome, standing before Nero. Think about many of the other Christians that had to face Roman governors time and again because Christianity was being questioned by Rome. Think about how in the first few years of the church, it starts off in the city of Jerusalem and they seem to stay there. Jesus or God had told them, Acts chapter 1 at verse 8, you shall be my witnesses, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the uttermost parts of the earth. He allows the persecution of those Christians at that time to start spreading the gospel to the world like he commanded to do. So you see, a lot of the things that I'm trying to emphasize here, a lot of the things that we're reading here could fit history all the way down through time. And people continue to look at these passages and say, the Lord's going to be here. The Lord's coming. The Lord's coming. The Lord's coming. I think I mentioned, it's been a while. There was a fellow by the name of Hal Lindsey who wrote The Late Great Planet Earth. And he said by the year 1988, the Lord will have returned. Why 1988? 1948, Israel had been reestablished as a nation. And so he says within that time frame, then the Lord shall return. Come 1988, we're still here, obviously, we're 2021. He said, well, Hal Lindsey said, I could have made a mistake. A generation could be 100 years. Jesus is talking about things they would see at that moment in time. But many of the things that he had prophesied about could very well fit many, many other situations where kingdoms fell. We can't really sit back and say for sure that this is maybe the end of the world as we know it when these things all start happening. Remember again what he said in Matthew chapter 25, of that day and hour no man knows, only the Son of Man. So it seems like that as I look at it, here is my understanding, my opinion, that when things are going great, that might be the time to be a little bit more concerned, because that's going to be at a time when we're not expecting it. God uses nations to destroy other nations. He's going to use the Romans to destroy Jerusalem. And so he's telling them this. And Jesus is just trying to prepare them for what is about to happen. And he says, it's time for us to end now, but I just want to just get this idea across to you. Please, if you would, for your homework this next week, read Matthew 24 and 25 and compare it with what he's saying here in Luke chapter 21. And then let's come back and we'll discuss it some more next week. Any other comments or questions, thoughts, ideas? Well, all right, then I'm going to stop the recording and y'all spend some time with one another, okay?